you taking the time out of your day to hear about the changes that we're doing and to learn more about them. I just want to note that this webinar is being recorded and that the recording is going to be available afterwards. So to start, would like to the purpose for this webinar today is to promote the recent changes to the zoning bylaw, which allow up to 4 units per lot on all urban residential zones, and also to provide some design considerations that need to be addressed in achieving this. So the contents of this presentation are based on the Guide for Developing Small-Scale Multi-Unit Housing, which we published this week. And I'm also going to link it in the chat as well, but it can be found on the Engage Whitehorse page. I'm also going to drop the link in the chat here shortly. Just want to note that the city is committed to improving its level of service and our permitting processes. And we're doing that through some initiatives like the e-permitting and the building workshops coming up next week. But today is not meant to be an in-depth discussion on that topic. So for the people we have presenting today, my name is Johanna Merglowski. I'm a planner too with Planning and Sustainability Services. And we also have Darcy McCord. He's a senior planner with planning and the one leading the overall zoning bylaw rewrite. And he also led the adoption of these changes that we're discussing today. Then we have Micah Olish. He's a senior development officer with Land and Building Services, and they would be the one reviewing your development permit applications. And then we have Sheila Baxendale, a private development technologist too with engineering services. And yeah, then we have Richard Diamond. He's a supervisor of building inspections. They'll be looking at your building permits. Okay, so for the webinar outline, we'll start off providing a brief summary of the recent zoning changes, and Darcy's going to walk us through that. And then Micah will touch on some design considerations that need to be addressed to do this. And our engineering team will go through some servicing considerations. And then Richard will touch on building codes. And to wrap things up, we'll briefly touch on development incentives that are available through the city as well as some other government organizations, and go over some resources that are available to help you. And then we're going to our Q&A. We're planning to spend about half the time allocated for the presentation and then the other half to answer any questions that you have. So for a bit of housekeeping, you probably already noticed that we turned everybody's cameras off and the mics are turned off as well during the presentation. And then we can enable the mics during the Q&A if you want to speak to us directly. And if you do want to do that, we just ask that you raise your hand so we know who to enable the mic for. So during the presentation, we'll hold the questions to the end, but feel free to put them in the Q&A, just the button up top on your screen. I'll be monitoring the chat as well, but it's just easier to keep track of the questions if they're in the Q&A instead. So I'll pass this over to Darcy now to talk about the zoning changes.
Great, thanks, Johanna, and thanks to everyone who has joined us today. So yeah, I wanted to go over some of these changes. This came about in April of this year. Council adopted some amendments to the zoning bylaw with the purpose to enable a wider range of opportunities for residential development. This is part of the overall zoning bylaw rewrite project. which is still underway, and we expect to bring a whole new zoning bylaw to council for consideration next year. But council was keen to see some changes happen sooner than that, to do with housing and enabling more housing. So that's why we brought about this initial round of housing related amendments. This is just one of many different um, aspects of a strategy to increase the housing supply within Whitehorse. So to summarize the changes, the big one is, if you don't mind moving to the next slide there, Johanna. The big change is that up to 4 units per lot are allowed in all urban single detached zones. There's sort of in conjunction with that, some relaxation of site coverage and setbacks in some zones where you provide additional units. There's some changes that enable more units in the RCM and RCM3 zones. Those are the multiple housing residential zones. So the living and garden suite regulations have been relaxed, and some parking regulations as well, all with the aim to make it easier to build more housing. I'll go over each of these in a little bit more detail here. So the 4 units per lot. So this applies to all urban residential zones. So that's the RCS, RCS2, RCS3, RD, RR, RS, and RS2 zones. Just about any lot in those zones is now eligible to build up to 4 units. There is one exception, which is attached dwellings, and by that we mean, for example, a duplex where each unit is on a separate fee simple lot. It's attached to a unit on a separate lot. Those sites are not able to build the 4 units, but they can still add suites, living or garden suites, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Um, there are still site design and servicing requirements that continue to apply. So setbacks, maximum building heights, maximum site coverage, parking and landscaping regulations continue to apply with some changes, which I'll also talk about shortly. So this slide sort of shows what we envision these changes could look like on the ground. So it shows sort of a mix of lots that have developed additional units on their lot, sort of in the context of a typical residential block. These are just examples, but it does kind of show the various configurations of multi-unit housing that could be possible and how it fits within the neighborhood. On the lot level basis, here are a few examples of configurations that might be possible. So 4 units is the maximum number of units, but there might be some site characteristics or developer objectives that make it more feasible to develop only 2 or 3 units. And those so we've kind of shown a range of examples here. But really, the 4 units, provided you meet all the development regulations, the 4 units or up to 4 units can be in any configuration. For the site coverage and setback, there are some modest relaxations to those that apply to some zones. So, for example, in the RS zone, the maximum site coverage currently and typically is 40%. But if you provide an additional unit, you can increase the maximum site coverage to 50%. Similarly, with setbacks, the typical regulation in the RS zone is the side yard setback is 1.5 meters on one side, 3 meters on the other. However, if you provide an additional unit, you can reduce the setback to 1.5 meters on both sides. So that's just a couple examples of those relaxations. An important point here, though, is that the these relaxations are not greater than what's already allowed in some other residential zones. So so that 50% limit for site coverage limit, for example, is the maximum. That's the same as what's already allowed in some residential zones. There are some changes to the living and garden suite regulations. These terms are used. Every municipality has kind of different terms for these types of dwelling, extra dwellings on a lot. In Whitehorse, the terms we use are living suite and garden suite. A living suite is a separate, self-contained unit within the same building as a principal dwelling. It can be below, beside, above, in front, or behind, but it has to be attached to the principal dwelling. A garden suite is on the same lot, but is not attached to the principal dwelling. So we kind of distinguish based on whether it's attached or not. The living and garden suites are now allowed in conjunction with more housing types. So you don't mind, just there we go. Thanks. You can develop living or garden suites in conjunction with duplex, triplex, and townhouse housing. You can develop up to 2 suites in any combination where suites are allowed. So that could be 2 living suites, 2 garden suites, or 1 of each. There's no separate minimum lot size for suites anymore. So it used to be that for example, there may be minimum lot size for a single detached house was 400 square meters, but if you wanted to build a suite, it had to be 500 square meters. That sort of suite specific minimum lot size has been eliminated. So as long as you have a lot that the zoning is right, then you can add 1 or 2 suites to that. The location of garden suites has been expanded. So they're also now, they used to be that they were only allowed in the rear yard. Now they're allowed in the front and side yard if you have a big enough lot to permit enough space to fit those and still meet all the setbacks. And there are some small changes to the setbacks for garden suites as well. To basically enable a garden suite to be placed anywhere that an accessory structure such as a detached garage or shed, anywhere that an accessory structure is allowed, you can also place a garden suite. There are some changes to the RCM and RCM3 zones. So these are the multiple housing residential zones. RCM the RCM zone used to only prescribe specific housing forms. It said triplex, fourplex, townhouse, and apartment housing was allowed. That's been expanded to include any form of multiple housing. So any sort of configuration that you can come up with, whether it's stacked units or any sort of variation on that is now allowed. And the maximum density in the RCM zone has also been eliminated. So there's no limit on the number of units, provided you meet all the other development regulations. The RCM3 zone, that's the cottage cluster zone, which only allows it's multiple housing, but it only allows single detached, duplex, and triplex housing forms within that. So kind of little clusters, smaller clusters of units. Those units, though, can now provide suites within them. So that's another way of providing some potential for suites to be provided in that zone. And finally, there are some changes to the parking regulations as well. So typically the parking requirement for residential uses is 1 parking space per dwelling unit. There's a relaxation for suites now where if you provide a second suite, you don't need to provide a second parking space for that suite. So for example, the principal dwelling requires a parking space. A principal dwelling plus 1 suite would require 2 parking spaces, 1 for each of the units. But if you provide a third unit as a suite, either living or garden suite, you don't have to provide a third parking space anymore. So in this instance, it would be 2 parking spaces are required to cover the 3 units. There's a change to the siting regulations for parking as well. It used to be that parking in a driveway had to be set back beyond the entire parking space had to be set back beyond the yard setback, which would typically mean that the parking space had to start between 3 and 6 meters from the front lot line. That's been reduced to 1 meter. So parking in a driveway can be within 1 meter of the front property line, and that just provides a little bit more flexibility in the site design, and less of the site area needs to be devoted to driveway and parking spaces. It also makes it easier to fit parking in front of the house rather than in some cases kind of requiring it to be beside the house. There is still a maximum driveway width, however, which remains unchanged. And the last change here is this is to do with residential development in commercial zones. So most residential multiple housing developments require visitor parking and in some cases loading zones to be provided for residential uses in commercial zones, and this would cover most of downtown and in the sort of neighborhood centers in the various neighborhoods. The visitor parking is no longer required, and the loading spaces are no longer required. So it makes it a little bit easier to provide the required parking and doesn't require that additional parking be provided for visitors or loading. So that's about it for the changes. Brief summary there, and I will be happy to take any questions at the end of the presentations. But for now, I'll turn it over to Micah, and he can discuss a little bit more of the design considerations for developing under these new regulations. So over to you, Micah.
Thanks, Darcy. Okay, so as Darcy just described, the zoning bylaw has been altered substantially to be able to allow for more dense developments. But there are some elements that haven't been changed, and there are still quite a few design elements that are still required by the zoning bylaw that may still limit the amount of density that you can reach on any given lot. Especially in regards to the setback and coverage regulations that Darcy just went over. So if there is more than one building on a lot, though, then note that only one building has to meet those front and exterior side setback regulations. Change slide, please. Thank you. So regarding the entrances, each building on the lot has to have at least one entrance facing the street. This side is what we call the facade, and in comprehensive zones, like in Whistle Bend, where many of you are developing currently, then each building's facade has to meet those design guidelines for comprehensive zones that are laid out in the zoning bylaw. So some of those are the front garage length limitations, where access is only from the front and there isn't a lane access, then you can have that front garage, but then still no portion of the garage can protrude past the facade by more than 50% of the garage's interior depth. The facades still have to show at least the 2 types or colors of siding. The primary facade color cannot be the same as the primary facade color of the residence next to it. And there has to be some sort of entrance feature that is at least 2 meters deep and with a width that's at least 25% of the width of that facade. There's still storage obligations as well. So when you're creating new residences like a different garden suite, no matter where it's located, even though we've opened up some more yards where you can put the garden suites, then there's still a regulation that you can't store goods like compost or recycling or refuse bins, or also just items associated with residential living in the front or exterior side yards in any zone. So that doesn't just apply to comprehensive, but across the board in Whitehorse. Also, if you've been hired by a property owner to increase the density and they think that they want to have a new residence on their lot, they should keep in mind that that might be taking away from space that they're currently using to store items like RVs, trailers, boats, right? If you put the the garden suite where the boat used to be stored, then there may not be anywhere else on the lot to store it legally. Regarding, no, sorry, still on that one slide. There we go. Regarding the walkways from the entrance, the walkways are required in all the comprehensive zones, have to be at least 1.5 meters in width, and you have to have a connection to the street or sidewalk where there is a sidewalk to the entrance of any residence that you have on site, and also to any parking spaces. So if the parking space is in the rear and there's a sidewalk in the front, then each residence needs to have that connection to both the sidewalk and to the parking spaces in the back. I don't, the number 3 is item there refers to the building and plumbing bylaw, but I don't really deal with that too much. I don't know if Richard wants to jump in and say anything or relevant to orientation of entrances there, Richard.
Yeah, not so much. Thanks, Micah. Not so much
Okay.
the orientation of entrances, but when we're looking at how we get out of buildings, main entrances have to be, if they face an alley, it's easy. If you're exiting one, say, a garden suite, and you have to go past the principal residence, you have to be leery of openings in the principal residence to meet the requirements of the building code for the exterior part of exits. You got to be, windows have to be about 10 feet above the ground. So there's some challenges there. And also with the plumbing code, the increased loads on your water service. So the plumbing code looks at it from the property line to the building only. Shayla can comment more about the from the main to the property line, and these are all things we'll look at during the permitting process.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, next slide. Right. So as I mentioned just before, where there is a lane, then access still has to be from the lane. And there's only generally one access per parcel allowed. There are some exceptions, but 90% of the time it's just going to be, if you have one parcel, then you can only have the one access. Where there is no lane, then the driveway can be between 6 meters and 10 meters wide, depending on the frontage of the width of the parcel. Generally, it's just going to be, you're going to be allowed the width of the frontage divided by 2, 50% of that width. And all of the parking spaces, of course, have to meet minimum size. We found that some developers don't know what that size is. So if you're not sure, please go ahead and ask. In general, it's they're 9 feet by 19 feet, but there can be variation. So if you want to know about that, feel free to ask me. And also, we cannot approve stacked parking. So where you have one vehicle space directly behind another vehicle, you have to be able to access all parking spaces at all times, even if all the parking spaces are filled. Where you have a parking space where you're going to require people going in and out around the set parking spaces, then you need a two-way drive aisle width of 6.7 meters. So for multiple residential developments, if you're putting in more than 3 residences, then it does trigger the need for a Class 2 bicycle rack. The Class 2 bicycle rack just means an exterior rack. We don't really have a lot of regulations specifying what those can look like, but as you can see on the slide, there are a couple suggestions, and they need to be somewhere on the lot where they can be accessed by the people using the houses. Next slide. Landscaping. So it's still 1 tree or 3 shrubs is usually what they're concentrated on, what all developers know that they have to provide in comprehensive zone lot in a Whistle Bend lot. But what gets missed sometimes is that in addition to that 1 tree or 3 shrubs, the zoning bylaw also specifies that the whole landscaped area or the whole front yard also needs to have some sort of suitable landscaping cover. So the front yard in this case means the area that extends across the whole width of the lot between both sidelines and right from the front property line to the nearest permitted building or structure. So that'll be the minimum front setback. And that whole thing outside of any driveway that you put in is supposed to be landscaped. So the suitable landscaping material is pretty broad, and as you probably know, we do allow xeriscaping, i.e. gravel, but it should be landscaping gravel. So we shouldn't be seeing driveway crush around the 1 tree or 3 shrubs. And all sections of that gravel must be interspersed with organic material as well. I think we're doing pretty well on the sizes of the trees and shrubs. We've had issues with that in the past, but it mostly seems to be being met at this point. If you have any questions about also what the minimum sizes are for landscaping additions, please let me know. Thank you. And we'll move on to the engineering.
Hi, everybody. So yeah, we were going to just touch on a couple of things to consider for this type of development that engineering would be looking at when a development permit application is submitted. All of the engineering requirements are still applicable, but we'll just touch on a couple of things that might apply specifically to this type of development, things to consider. If you're not already familiar with the engineering department's guidelines for development, we have 2, and private development is categorized in one of 2 categories, one being simple development and one being complex. Ultimately, simple focuses on single-family developments, duplex developments, townhouse developments, and complex development is in line with, from a residential perspective, the definition of multiple housing in the zoning bylaw, which applies to 3 units or more. So for simple developments located on a new lot in a new subdivision, like Whistle Bend, for instance, you do not need to engage a professional engineer to prepare your design. If you are carrying out a simple development that is located in an already built out area of Whitehorse, so say on a Porter Creek lot or a Riverdale lot, we do ask that you engage an engineer due to the fact that there's some complexities that are introduced to designing to match existing conditions around your site. If you are carrying out anything that involves 3 units or more, that falls within the complex category, and we will require you to engage a professional engineer and have the drawings, the submissions sealed by your engineer. I think that's it on the guidelines. Maybe next slide. Dale Sebulek is going to be speaking to the services here.
Hi, everybody. For a development in Whistle Bend where existing services are 1-inch water and 4-inch sewer, you may be able to do up to 2 or 3 units on the existing service. In other areas of town, such as Riverdale, Porter Creek, Copper Ridge, that typically have 3/4 inch copper, you will be limited to what you can build. We will defer to building inspections for a fixture count for those services, but more than likely you're going to have to replace your water service. That'll need to be upsized at the developer's cost. 4-inch sanitary is adequate for up to 4 units. Another thing I should mention is you should reach out to ATCO ahead of time and find out about their infrastructure capacities and servicing in the area that you're proposing to develop. That's about it for me.
I'll just add one thing to the minimum service size that's currently covered in the servicing standards manual is going to be reviewed internally at the city here, as it's going to inform how servicing to new lots and new phases of development in Whitehorse will be provided to lots. So we will be sure to publish any changes that come up in relation to that. Last slide, something that we really wanted to outline to developers, something to consider when you're planning your development, that can be a bit of an obstacle, would be the required fire flows for your development. The city reviews fire flows for development for anything of 4 units or more. So in this scenario, if you're maximizing the number of units available on a single residential lot, you will need to submit fire flow calculations. The method that we use for reviewing this is a document and a formula that's put together by the Fire Underwriters Survey. They're a national organization. Our compliance with their documents do have an impact on the city's insurance grades. One of the reasons we use that particular method for reviewing fire flows. When we talk about fire flows, there's a couple of terms that are used, and I'll just cover those just to provide some clarification. Available fire flow is basically it's what's available on the municipal system. So it's the amount of water that's available to provide fire protection to your development. Required fire flow is what you arrive at when you carry out the calculation in the Fire Underwriter Survey document. The required fire flow can be impacted by a number of aspects of your proposed development, some of which would include your total floor area, the distance from your proposed buildings to surrounding existing structures, or permitted structures if you're in a new subdivision. If there's development that's permitted on the adjacent property, we're going to be looking at that. Location of existing hydrants, intention to install a sprinkler system, and what construction assemblies you might be considering for your proposed development. In some areas of Whitehorse, the existing municipal infrastructure was designed to support single family development. So there are some areas where it can be a little challenging, albeit it's not achievable. Sometimes it's just a matter of revisiting some of the aspects of your development to bring it in line with what's available on our system. Places like Whistle Bend, the system has been designed to a degree to accommodate a fair amount of development, so you might have less restrictions there. I'd like to just finish up by saying the Engineering Services Department is always here to answer any questions. Happy to clarify or answer any specifics. Feel free to reach out to us. Oh, and another thing, I would like to bring up the fact that pre-application meetings can be very handy. It's a service that's offered by the city. Before you start going down the detailed design route, you can fill out a form and request a pre-application meeting through a development officer, and we can sit down and go over the specifics of your development, and discuss any implications of the specifics of your development at that time. And I'll leave it there.
And on to the building code. That'll be me. Thanks, Shayla, for all that. So, of course, everything in the building code still applies, and there have been absolutely no changes in the building code to go along with the relaxations in the zoning. And so there are some things to consider early in your design process. Considering travel distance, some of the things already mentioned, there's actually the travel distance, distance to hydrants, having a path of travel exterior that gets you safely off the property. Those have to be illuminated. You know, there are adding a one living suite within a house is fairly straightforward with smoke separations. When you start getting into multiple suites, it starts getting more complicated and more parts of the code apply. It's much more restrictive. Same thing with adding a garden suite in the back. We have to deal with spatial separations to property lines and to the buildings. That can limit the amount of openings and the type of construction. So you could find yourself in a position where you don't have enough space between the buildings so that it works with the existing building and the new building. So you may have to remove windows or change some other things on the existing building. So the best recommendation we can make from building is that you hire a consultant or a professional that has some good code experience that can kind of take you through what you can do. Of course, you can do anything if you spend the money, but it's good to know up front what your options are and what changes you can make in your wants, if you will, to make it a more cost-effective project. Unfortunately, there's not much else I can say. Everything is site and building specific with the building code when it comes to multiple units. So again, just you know, you should consider these items very early on in your design process.
Okay, thanks, Richard. I just want to briefly highlight the development incentives that are available for these types of projects. And as of 2024, following a comprehensive review from the city's development incentives, we kind of shifted our focus towards encouraging non-market and supportive and rental housing. However, we are offering a suit incentive program that individuals can benefit from. And this incentive provides up to $5,000 in reimbursements, which can cover the cost of the development cost charges, which are like around $2,200, as well as other associated fees, such as permit and inspection costs. And you can claim 2 suite incentives per property, which also aligns with the Government of Yukon's incentive, which has a matching 10,000 per suite incentive, also allowing for 2 incentives per property. Yeah, they also have a housing initiatives fund, which supports developments for 4 units or more, and includes affordable housing requirements. If you have any questions on the funds, feel free to reach out. But you can also follow the resources. They're linked in the guide. And yeah, looking ahead, the Government of Canada is planning to launch a secondary suite loan program in early 2025, where the program will provide loans for up to $40,000 to support secondary suite development. So stay tuned for that. Then before we go into our Q&A, I'd like to highlight some resources and upcoming events that might be helpful for these types of developments. So there's some resources available. The guide includes links to several resources from external agencies and organizations, and standard housing design catalogs are also becoming more widely available. Just to note that these are not pre-approved by the City of Whitehorse, but can be useful if you want to start, like as a start point or a source of inspiration. Additionally, the CMHC is set to release a standard housing design catalog for the north in early 2025, which is being developed in collaboration with an architect based in Whitehorse, so it ensures to reflect the northern design context. And then we have some upcoming events. In late January, we'll be hosting a small-scale multi-unit development workshops. The exact dates and registrations are still forthcoming, but these sessions will be facilitated by an architect, and will dive deeper into today's topics, providing hands-on and opportunities to explore site planning and design considerations. And then we're also still in the process of rewriting our zoning bylaw, which is expected to wrap up next year. So to stay updated, you can go on our zoning bylaw rewrite page on Engage Whitehorse, where you can also subscribe to the page to get notified if there's updates released. So yeah, that concludes our presentation. If you could take a moment to complete like a brief survey for the webinar today, I'll just drop the link into the chat here. We greatly appreciate your feedback. Like it helps us to improve future sessions like this. And we'll open up for questions. I'll just drop the survey into the chat real quick. Yeah, I see we already got some questions in our chat. Some of them had already been answered, but I'm just gonna share them with the group. So the first question we got was, are visitor parking spaces still required in multifamily housing? And Darcy has already commented on it, but I don't know if Darcy, if you want to elaborate on that.
Well, just to reiterate the response. So at this point, that visitor parking exemption only applies to residential uses in commercial zones. So there's no change to the parking requirements for residential uses in multiple housing zones. That would be the RCM, RCM2, RCM3, and RM zones. However, there's possibility of looking at further changes with the adoption of the new bylaw.
Perfect. Thanks, Darcy. And got another question here. Are there any privacy rules, side entry overlooking neighbors' decks, any rules on placing barbecues, garbage storage areas, or flues close to neighbors' HRV vents?
So I can respond to the first part of that. For the most part, the zoning bylaw doesn't sort of wade in on sort of preservation of privacy in terms of the placement of elements like decks or windows and that sort of thing. There was already a bit of existing text in there pertaining specifically to garden suites when their setback is reduced to less than 1.5 meters. That says the windows have to be placed to minimize overlook onto the neighbors and doors can't be placed on that side and so on. But for the most part, the zoning bylaw hasn't previously had any regulations pertaining to that and still continues to not generally not have regulations around that. The second part, Richard provided a response, and then I don't know if he wants to reiterate that, just to do with the sort of relative placement of HRVs in relation to other elements like barbecues or garbage areas and so on.
Yes, thanks, Darcy. Yeah, I mean, barbecues, we don't regulate through the building code. You know, as I can suggest, people look at their manufacturer's recommendations on those. Flues are generally going to be exiting above roof level, a minimum of 2 feet, usually above the ridge on a narrow building. And whereas your HRVs and intakes are going to be located mid-wall or down towards the ground level. Everything we do in the building codes related to property line and not the neighboring building. So there's not much there regulation wise other than just following the manufacturer's recommendations and any CSA standards. But there's very little there that relates one property to another.
All right. Thanks, Richard. So just want to remind people that can also raise their hands if you want to ask a question. But we got one more here in the chat. Will the city be requiring new development areas, for example, new phases of Whistlebend, to allow for maximum usage or 4 units per lot? Water and sanitary services, for example. And I think Sheila's already responded to that. I don't know if you want to.
I'll just reiterate that yes, we are taking a look right now at minimum service sizing as it's spelled out in the servicing standards manual to inform what servicing should look like for lots and new phases of development in Whitehorse and new subdivisions in light of the zoning bylaw changes. We're not yet there yet. We're carrying out some internal meetings and discussions, and we'll be sure to keep everybody updated on any changes that might be coming out there.
All right. Thank you, Sheila. Yeah, don't know if anybody has any other question. Oh, we have one here. John, I just enabled your mic, but you still have to unmute yourself in order to speak.
Okay, I have a couple questions. The first one is on servicing sizes. It was mentioned that some Whistlebend could potentially handle up to 3 units. Is that based on the number of fixtures, or what is the trigger for having to go to a higher service?
I can answer that one for you, John. The water service pipe sizing is based on the fixture count rather than actually the number of fixtures. So for instance, a regular bathroom group is 6 fixture units. They're all assigned in the plumbing code, and so you total for all the buildings. You can do things like minimize hose bibs and that to keep your fixture counts down. So it all comes down to the number of bathrooms, the type of plumbing, the type of fixtures, the number of hose bibs, and all those things you use it, and then it's all added up, and you have to be within, I believe those 1 inch that we're using there, the HDPM is good for about 48 fixture units, which is way beyond a copper of the same size would be down to about 20 fixture units. So 2 units for pretty much for sure you can get in. 3, you'd have to do some careful design.
Okay. My next question, it's my understanding that once you have over a certain number of units, you're no longer in Part 9 of the building code. What's the trigger number of units for that?
That would be, it's not quite as simple that we have 2 possibilities here. If the footprint of the building is over 600 square meters, it's Part 3 no matter what. With sort of townhouse setups and small multifamily, it's based on the building. If you have a number of buildings on site, they're each looked at independently. But in one group of buildings, when we get over 4 units, that's what we're going to be calling a complex Part 9 building, which is something in between, you know, something that's very simple and something that's much more complicated. And that's because of the extra fire separations, fire blocking, fire stopping, different things that we come up with, or that the code has us looking at that relate to fire safety and so on.
So just to follow up, is that at 4 units or is that more than 4 units?
That would be more than 4 units, but we're still talking a little bit about what exactly that's going to look like. For example, if you had a 6-unit townhouse, I wouldn't see that as being any more complicated than a 4-unit townhouse, as long as you keep under that footprint of 6,000 square feet, 6,400 square feet. If you got into, and that's like a straight up townhouse, if you had something where you're getting into more than 4 units and you have up downs, that's going to get you more into a complex Part 9. It's just about the complexity of the building and the level of you know, the amount of design required and oversight during construction.
Okay. Did you have another question there, John, or was that all?
No, I'm good.
So you got a comment about antisocial zoning amendment in the chat. I don't know, like Richard, Annette, if you would like to kind of clarify what you meant by that.
So, I was talking to myself for a minute. Yeah, I just think if you're not taking, if you've got a side entry to a new unit, you can basically overlook your neighbours. You could have a smoke vent that's going into their HRV intakes, or you could stick all your refuse bins right next to it. There's nothing to say keep away from it, and that to me would be antisocial. So that's why I was making a bit of a sarky comment about it being an antisocial zoning amendment.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Yeah. Is there any more questions? Okay.
Pretty
There's
quiet
nothing.
group.
Yeah, I don't know if you wanted to say anything there, Darcy, or
Oh, in response to the antisocial thing, you know, sure. I think it does kind of. I see the point there. It's not a new problem that's being introduced by these changes. There's always been sort of, you know, buildings can be a certain distance apart. There's never been a rule against, you know, any of those specific elements. And I think to some extent, like the zoning bylaw doesn't force people to be good neighbors. And I don't think that we really want to sort of be so prescriptive as to sort of set really specific requirements to that extent. But I think, you know, we expect that our neighbors are going to be reasonable and be neighborly and considerate of their neighbors. And I don't think there's any change between what the rules have always been and then these new changes. Like I don't see that it really introduces any new potential for that, other than that there might be you know, might be more neighbors sharing the same property line, and maybe that increases the chance of that. But again, I think like I think we'd like to have faith that people are going to be good neighbors, and we're not going to be able to regulate out the bad neighbors. That's always going to be the case in some instances, and I don't think the zoning bylaw is really equipped to deal with those kind of scenarios.
all right. Thank you for that. If there's not any more questions, I think we can wrap this up. Just a reminder to please fill out the survey that's posted to the chat. And
thanks everyone for attending, and just want to say that I really appreciate your engagement, and yeah, we do have these workshops coming up in January, so and you can hear about them. There will be some promotion, but one way that you can hear about them is subscribing to the project, the zoning bylaw rewrite project at engagedwhitehorse.ca, and then you can be notified directly of future updates with the zoning bylaw rewrite, including these workshops that are kind of delving deeper into the topics we've discussed today, and and a little bit more of a hands-on approach. So we hope to have you continue to participate in that respect.
Yeah. Thank you. We can hang around a little longer if there's any questions coming up, but yeah, thank you for attending today.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Yeah, just feel free to contact us too, like by email if you have any follow-up questions or just didn't feel comfortable talking in the webinar.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks.